Hi, I'm Ron Wakkary. I'm a lecturer in this elective designed for debate alongside Minha Lee. And I'm also the author of the book Things We Could Design for More Than Human-Centered Worlds, a book that we're going to focus on in detail, particularly in the first half of this elective. Now, I'm giving this talk from Vancouver, where I live. And here in Vancouver, we are on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Now, in Canada, it's an emerging, or I guess a growing tradition to give land acknowledgements before we gather, before we talk, and it's important. It's an important acknowledgement of the fact that majority of us, including myself, are settlers on this land, that the original human inhabitants were the indigenous and First Nations peoples, and that this is a complicated, a challenging history, and one that's in need of reconciliation. Hence the notion that the territories are unceded, so it's an ongoing, alive history, if you like. And the acknowledgement is also important to really make clear that many of the assumptions, many of the values that we hold, what we believe to be the importance of the societies we've constructed, are one of many. And in fact, here in Canada, this is a long history, and there are alternatives. There are other ways of knowing, other ways of being on this land or on this planet. And it's important to not only acknowledge, but perhaps even consider and debate and be open to this alternative ways of knowing our epistemologies. And it's in this spirit, I think, that I'd like to approach this elective. This idea that within design, that the assumptions we hold, which in large part inherit the same history that I just talked about in Canada, that is of colonialism and Western European thought, and that we debate some of the many assumptions, and we reconsider and we rethink and we open ourselves up to be expansive, and the way in which we think about design, and generous in the way in which we know how to go about designing. So I think that's the importance of it, and that's the spirit, again, of this class. So this talk, I don't know what to call it. I guess it's a lecture, but really I want to consider it more as a reading guide. A reading guide to the book. In this particular case, it's the introductory chapter of the book. But I think this will be true of the subsequent discussions or talks or reading guides as we have in the next couple of weeks. Because I realize how much of a challenge this is, or new this may be to many of you, to read so extensively as part of one of the electives, but to engage design through reading and through philosophy. But it's important that as you formulate your views, of course, and your positions. And so I want to position these reading guides more as a framework to kind of ask questions with, a framework to kind of single out what I think are key points, and maybe through interaction and iteration with you, what you see as key points we can bring into these discussions. And again, so it's really more of a guide, roadmap, a framework, so that we can be really interactive in the way in which we approach the text, or the book, that is, and then gives you the space to formulate your opinions, to create alternatives to questions, so we have a sort of debate within the debate. So I want to speak to the motivation of the book. Why do I think it's important? Why do I want to unbuild design, to rethink human-centered design in terms of post-humanism? So what is the motivation for that? Well, in many ways we can say we live in an era of human exceptionalism, and human-centered design is a good example of that, where the belief is that human reason will achieve a level of progress and improvement and betterment of not only us, but everyone around us. And it's essential that we always value and prioritize humans and human goals and human aims and the improvement of humans over everything else. That's a humane way of living and being in the world. And human-centered design has really inherited that notion. So why is that a problem? Well, this privileging of humans has done two things. On the one hand, I think that we have willfully excluded others. That is, there's a separation in humanism, the belief in human reason over nature, for example, which allows us to pillage and do what we've done to the planet. And and of course, there is a relationship, one of domestication and exploitation of those animals that are not human. And even to be human is used as one people are not, some people are considered not human enough, and therefore again open to exploitation and inequities. But while we've had this sort of purposeful kind of exclusion or privileging, which leads to exclusion, we've also been blind to what our real impact has been. The real effects that we've had on those around us, the real effects that we've had on the planet, and the scale of those effects. So these are sort of embodied in two notions. One is humanism, and this ongoing school of thought around humanism, and the other is the Anthropocene. And they're contradictory, but they're both pressing issues and why I think we need to rethink design. So let me dive in a little bit more detail. So what do I mean by humanism? Well, humanism is an era of philosophical thinking that goes back to, is really the heart of Western European thought, that is really, in large part, the dominant way of thinking, whether it's been done through economics or military, but it's really the dominant mode of thought on this planet. And rooted in a rethinking of the ideals of ancient Greece and philosophies at that time, to rethink, to really hit its peak in the 17th century in Europe. And this is an image by Leonardo da Vinci. I'm sure some of you have seen this before. It's known as the Vitruvius Man. And what it is the application of the ideal proportions of architecture by the architect Vitruvius, who adopted Platonic ways of thinking of what is perfect and what is an ideal form or set of geometries that could then be applied to architecture and ideal proportions. And here Da Vinci has applied this to the human form, or to the human body. And it really has come to symbolize this idea of humanism, or the age of enlightenment, or the perfection of what it is to be human, and the drive to progress a notion of humanity, and the assumption that if we improve or progress humanity, that all else will progress alongside, that humans, in some sense, it's through human reason alone that we can seek a better world. Now, the challenge, of course, I mentioned some of the exclusions. There are some exclusionary thoughts by the privileging of humans. It is, again, that separation of nature, that turning nature into a resource that can be extracted, seeing it as not an error, not a place of reason, not a place of orderly thought, and not a place of humanity. And then, as well, as I mentioned, the rationale for the exploitation of those that are not at the top of the pyramid, that are not human. And as I said, the animals, for example. And then, as I said before, that simply to be human does not privilege one to be an ideal humanist, that one is not rooted in Western European thinking. That's a rationale for a lot of imperialist thinking and the colonial histories that we've inherited, that not all are considered to be human. Those that may be black or brown, or those are considered to be inhuman or subhuman, and there's a long history of exploitation and inequities, and invoking one's privilege over other humans in the name of humanism. So that's pretty rough. But this is this purposeful construction of thought that we call humanism, that has led to where we are, which I don't believe is sustainable, and has infused its way into, as I said, it's our dominant mode of thinking, so it's infused our way in our institutions. The university itself is a humanist construct. The idea that we have academic disciplines as bodies of knowledge, design as a discipline, is another humanist thought, that we can subdivide the world into different bodies of human knowledge. That the very laws and ways we act and the ways we think, we're so infused in notions of humanism, and clearly this is manifest in human-centered design. So this is something where I want to pose or think through differently, unbuild through post-humanist thinking. The other is the Anthropocene. And again, this is a contradictory thing. These two things coexist, the eras of humanism and the era of the Anthropocene. That is, the Anthropocene is the notion that the impact on the actions of human civilization are now part of the geological record for the first time. That we can see our influence on the planet on this global scale and geologically. So whether that be, here as a result of the things that we make, the technologies we use, so that the markers are radiation, for example, or plastics, or of all things chicken bones that are literally spread throughout the earth and they're part of the fossil record now, to show that we have influenced and shaped the planet at that level. And some of this has been willful. We know of the kinds of extractions that we do that have led to kind of what a massive scale of change on a planetary level. Agriculture has changed the world throughout, but much of this we did not know, such as plastics and so on. Now, this happened over a period of time, from some dated back actually to the Renaissance, others say the Industrial Revolution. The point is it coincided with much of humanist thought as a parallel, but the point is that it was something we were completely blind to. We actually, in the focus of what it was to be human, we somehow were completely unaware or blind to what our real impact was on the world around us. And so this kind of gets to the heart of the motivation. And again, we inherit this from in a design perspective. Design is very much a part of both projects. And in some ways, this is the heart of why we think about it on this level of the assumptions that derives the thinking behind and the real effects of what we do, as the motivation to rethink design. So the next thing I want to say, it's a relatively brief point, but it's about the idea that this discussion that I have in the book, and this idea of post-human, well, perhaps first of all, the idea of rethinking design, the need to go down at a deeper level and think through the assumptions and understand what the impacts are, the reality of what it is that we are doing, and then to constructively rethink a new approach. So I call this a critical and creative speculation. It is not new. There are others who have been doing this, and I point that out in the intro chapter, and I just want to emphasize that point here. Here are some of the examples, some of the books that I reference, and we'll put those in Canvas or on Microsoft Teams. And also there's specific literature on post-humanism in design, and we should have put up those references. Now, not expecting necessarily to read all of that now, but hopefully you can keep this list with you and something that you could later, as you have time, and this is something over a long period of time that you can just read and better know more in depth, if that's what you want to do. But the point here is that this is not a lone pursuit. There are fellow travelers along the way rethinking design. So at this point, I want to, take a step back and single out two key notions of post-humanism, which I think are important, and they're hard to grasp in part because we're trying to undo our thinking, our humanist ways of thinking about the world. Now, there's going to be a lot of philosophy in the book, and we'll have plenty of time to dive down deep and answer your questions and work through it. And I know it'll be challenging, but both Minha and I will be here to kind of help you work through these concepts. And there are a lot of examples in the book, and try to unpack what it is, and try to keep the points of philosophical thought relevant to what the discussion is. And I'm trying to be very light about that here in this introductory talk and in the introductory chapter. But I want to single out two particular post-humanist concepts because I think they're so important to ideas in the book, and very relevant to design. And I think that there's just something that will help. They're hard to wrap your head around in some ways, and so you have to kind of unthink our humanist learnings. So the first is the fact that there's not this separation between things. There's an interconnectedness, and specifically connections between nature, culture, humans, and technology. So humans and culture can kind of go together, then you have technology and nature. In humanist thought, much of this is separated. I talked already about how in humanist thinking, nature was seen in opposition to humans, where humans were civilized and reasoned, nature was unpredictable and wild, and it was a separate domain, independent. and one that we could exercise our domain over because of the fact that it was independent of us. We could conquer nature. But there's a lot of thinking now with technology is the same. So that quite reverse though, we also have a fear. We have a fear of nature. We also have a fear of technology. Technology will rule us. And so as if this notion that technology is a separate being or separate entity from us. And we have these notions of the artificial versus the natural, for example, that which is cultural and that which is natural, and that which is purely human, that which is purely nature, and that which is purely technology. In post-humanist thoughts, these are all not separated. They co-shape each other. They're interdependent. One depends on another to construct another. So there's the term nature culture. We actually can't have nature without our understanding it as humans. We shape what our understanding of nature is, but clearly we live in a world that is more than human, and that shapes us. So there's an interdependency, and there's no point in separating these two, and that's important. But it also is important with relation to technology. Technology is not something independent from us, and in that we're bound together. To be human now, we could not be who we are without technology, but technology could not be what it is without us. In fact, we can't think about, and I said this in the book, citing Don Idy and Haraway, that we could not be in a Garden of Eden. We could not be without technology. So the two terms there, and it's one concept, but nature culture and technicity. So we don't separate these terms out. So that's one main concept. The other is relationality. And this is it's connected to what we just talked about, but this idea of relationality in post-human concepts is that we don't think what it is to be human. We think about what it is to be human with something else. Meanings are always in relation to something else. I discussed how I am here in Vancouver in relation to the colonial history of this land and the Indigenous and the First Nations people. In respect to technology, your understanding of me, or I am understanding of you, is mediated through this video camera and through the video streaming. And so there's a relationality between these, and this also changes, so it's dynamic. So we always gain meaning within a given situation in relation to something else. There is nothing that is standalone or discrete. I am not always me. I am me in relation to other things. Okay, so just those two terms, well, three terms, but one is to bunch together: technicity and nature culture, and relationality. These are two important points. But let me give you an example to make it a little bit more concrete. This is, and you'll recall in the book I talk about mountain climbing quite a bit for some reason. And here I am again talking about mountain climbing. So this is a picture. I don't know if some of you may have seen this. This is the peak of Mount Everest. This was a day in May in 2019. It was actually quite a tragic day. A number of people died on this day as a consequence of this lineup, this traffic jam to get to the peak. For those of you who don't know, there's usually a short window that you have to climb the peak during daylight, and also when it's warm enough, but that you also need enough daylight to descend. In fact, the descent is often more dangerous than the ascent. More people die descending from the peak than climbing the peak. But the point here, that, acknowledging that tragedy, is that in this image you can see that Mount Everest is the most remote place above sea level on this planet. Yet we understand it, but yet we understand it thoroughly mediated through our cultural understanding of it, that it's a mountain to be climbed for those who are climbers. Others may have other notions of it, like religious or spiritual beliefs. But also so that's the sort of nature culture, but also the technicity, that we understand it through technologies, through photographs, or the climbers here through the climbing equipment that they have, through the Gore-Tex, that the understanding of its remoteness and it as a peak is related to both technology and culture, and vice versa. We then have cultural implications. We shape technologies in respect to things as remote as a mountain, or particularly Mount Everest, or the particular technologies needed to climb a mountain. So that I think this image is a good idea of that interconnectedness between nature, culture, and humans and technology. But also relationality, and I described this in the intro chapter. So to be donning mountain climbing equipment is then in relation to a mountain. How could it else how else could it be? You are a climber. You become a climber. You change who you are. And yet a mountain also changes, that it is relational to someone who's climbing. The mountain becomes a set of pathways or ascent paths up to its peak. And so Everest is not Everest without climbing. Climbing is not, to be a climber is not a climber without Everest. But again, there are other situations, whether it be religious, whether it be spiritual, whether it be historical, that one could set up these kind of relationality of meanings. So in the introductory chapter, I give a fairly detailed outline of the structure of the book, so what will follow in the remaining chapters. So here I just want to give a higher level, just sort of take a step back and a quick discussion about each of those three parts. The book is really organized in three parts, each of which tackles one of the three nouns in the title, things we could design. So I start in part one, which is chapters 2 and 3, with the understanding or the discussion around design. So, and here my goal, there's sort of two real main goals in this part. One is to unbuild design and to build it from its humanist, I guess, roots and its structures. And two, to create a space for an idea of something that's other than humanist in terms of design, so post-humanist. So why unbuild? Well, I mean, the idea that we would pursue, or I would pursue, something that was an alternative to humanism and human-centered design would mean it would not make much sense to take on the structures and the ways of thinking of humanist thinking or humanist thought. So this idea of a discipline itself, as I talked about earlier, is a body of human knowledge, and that design is seen as a discipline that has shared a foundation of which there are various sub-disciplines related to that, and there's a hierarchy of sub-disciplines. And in many ways, a discipline kind of polices what actually is design and what is not design, and what are the related sets of concepts that are part of the body of knowledge of design and is not. And it's that thinking that I really wanted to get away from. And in fact, I wanted to open design up to be a multiplicity of different kinds of designs without necessarily the shared foundation. This is very much a post-human, and I characterize as a nomadic practice way of thinking about design. So that's the first part. Find different means other than humanism to unbuild and to rethink design. And then the second one is the practical outcome, is that then, as a result, I have the space, in a sense, to explore, construct, speculate on what might be a post-human design without the baggage of human design as a discipline and the human-centered notions, whether that be a user, for example, usability, functionalism, etc. So that's the main aim of part one: unbuild design from its humanist roots and create space for a post-human approach to thinking about the way we design. So the second part is focused on things, and in some sense we could say this is the heart of the book. That is, if we're designing within a post-human context, are we designing something differently? And I argue yes, and it's partly a different understanding of what it is that we are designing. So this addresses aspects that we have talked about before in two ways. So first of all, this idea that I talked about of technicity and nature culture. So the things that we design, the technologies that we design, are connected to us. They're interconnected with what it means to be human. So things shape what it means to be human as humans shape what it means to be a thing or what it means to be technology. We can't think of these things separately. So it's really just making that point, underlying in the context of design, how nature culture or technicity is the way to understand what it is that we design. The second part of this section, part, I guess, the second part of this part, all right, I said it, is that if we think about, as I discussed the Anthropocene, that was the real effects, the real impact of the things we made. It's pretty clear that things have their own agency, in meaning that they have their own effects on the world. They change the world in ways that we don't intend. We call this in design unintended consequences, although I think everything, and you need much more than intentions to understand what the effects are and actions are that something has in the world, how it embodies or is in the world. And so unintended consequences is really just what always happens. And so thinking about things as being vital, or things of having agency. So if we think about the plastic, for example, as it transforms in something that we may use, but it becomes different forms of toxicity, works its way into different biosystems and life systems, and that this is a way in which a thing and elements of a thing have agency. So those are the two key parts I wanted to think about in rethinking about what it is that we design, that we have things which are interconnected with who we are. They shape who we are as humans as we shape what are things. And two, that things have their own agency. So the third part is the we in the title. So I've reserved this for the discussion of the designer. And I inherit a lot of what was already discussed. So the interconnectedness of things, vitality of things, and the way in which we understand design as a set of nomadic practices. So two main points happen here in part 3. One, I make the argument that given the vitality and agency of things, things don't only affect things in the world once they're designed, but they affect through the process of design. So a designer is in fact not exclusively human. A designer is both human and non-human, that a designer is an assembly of humans and non-humans. And so I try to describe, well, what does that mean, then how does a designer operate that way, but then what's the particular role for the human designer in this assembly of humans and non-humans. The other point in this part is that if we understand the effects, and I talked earlier about unintended consequences, many of these unintended consequences are matters of governance and politics. And I think we, in design today, in human-centered design, we tend to shun those politics outside of the process of design. So if you take social media, for example, it's a design and a platform with design, a way of interacting with design, but yet it is always governed by those other than designers, whether there's a parent trying to create, how much, trying to say how much a child can use social media or not, so to govern their usage of social media. Or it may be, unfortunately, it's corporations that in fact are managing the censorship and what can be said and what cannot be said on social media platforms because of political matters. And then the notion of privacy and data, and governments are regulating and governing how corporations or how platforms can use data or not use data, and what degree of informed consent we have to have around what essentially is our data. And unfortunately, these are all imperfect political arrangements. And what I try to argue in this part is the second aspect, that we need to think of political structures already when we think about what is the designer of things. So I discuss the notion of designer in the context of being political. All right, so now we're nearing the end of the talk, and I wanted to discuss the philosophy that's here and acknowledge, I think, what we're asking of you, but also discuss in the book the relation to philosophy and things, and then give a more sort of personal account of why I wrote the book. But let's get to the philosophy. Yes, there's a lot of philosophy here. So one, I want first of all acknowledge the challenge of that. I think again, we, as I said earlier, we're challenging you by really diving down deep in a theoretical text in a book to try to understand design. I mean, it's important that if in my case, that we really want to debate what human-centered design is or should not be, and perhaps the opportunities of post-human design. These are debates of assumptions, and these are debates of change. And in order to do that, we need to get at the underlying thinking behind here, and in some sense that's just generally speaking philosophical. So how do we tackle these ideas of what makes up design without going down, without talking about it on a philosophical level? And much of what we talk about with post-humanism is actually happened through philosophy. And humanism, as I talked about, is a philosophical endeavor, but it's not simply theory. this has worked its way into the, as I said, the institutions, into the laws, into the ways we've been taught, into the university structures that we talked about, disciplines, and simply the way we are. So these are pervasive philosophical notions that we need to kind of unpack. So that's why philosophy I think is important here. But rest assured that I will be here, Minha will be here, will engage and support and scaffold you, and also to formulate your own positions, not just to read and take in. So I think it'll engage us and provide resources as we engage in this debate. But having said that, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a designer and a design researcher. I make things. And I understand the world through making things. I know what the importance of that is, that this idea that that we make things, and making things is as much constructing the world and thought as philosophy. And I think that's where they share. Is either experimental philosophy in designing or there's experimental design in philosophy. I don't know which. But I think that what was important in the book was I held up the other end of the bargain, that is knowing, I can't remember now, maybe 50 or more things, objects, artifacts in the book, and they're useful in terms of trying to understand, help explain some of the philosophical concepts and show them in action, but also to kind of shape the philosophical concepts. And of course, philosophical concepts scaffold some of our understanding of what the effects of things are and what things actually do. So that was important, but I wanted to acknowledge that these are different ways of thinking, and so in their own right, they're different epistemologies, and there's a certain tension in the book between the two. But I think you can enter this in a philosophical framing or from a design framing, and ideally the entanglement of both. So I don't know. You will recall this is the last image in the chapter. This is my cat Rusty, and two things that I have made. One is the hook and one is the table on table in my house, in my living room actually. And as I say in the book, something I encountered when I came home from work. And this partly explains why I wrote the book. Now I discuss who I am and who I am as a narrator in the book, and that's important, but I want to focus on here on this dilemma. I see it as a dilemma. And so in the sense that here was this situation where it looked like there was a kind of self-contained bubble between, Mike the cat, my cat Rusty, the hook, and the table on table. And I wasn't sure where I was in this, and I felt like I should be part of this. In fact, legally speaking, a cat is my property, and the cat is dependent on me, so I have a certain domain over it. And I was, involved as a maker of the things that are there, the table, non-table, and the hook. And so in some sense, I should know exactly what's going on, and I should be very much a part of what's going on. And so I was on one level thinking, well, that's really the case. But this confidence was eroded by the fact that I also felt like I was not part of what was going on here. That I had no idea what was going on. That here were these things that, as a designer and as a human, I should know about. But I didn't know, and I didn't know what was going on, and it was both things were true in a sense, and it's this dilemma. And so working through this dilemma is really one of many different instances that said, I think much of what I know as a designer needs to be rethought, and there are moments where I need a more generous and more expansive way of thinking about it, and so that's why I wrote the book.